The morning was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that crept into your bones, making you uneasy, like the calm before a storm. I sat at the kitchen table, my knee propped up and wrapped in a tight bandage, staring at the AM radio that crackled with static. The familiar hum of the appliance-filled apartment was absent today. The steady beat of the city's rhythm, which had become background noise to me over the years, was nowhere to be found. The clock on the wall ticked 5:42 a.m. The kitchen light flickered overhead as I shifted my weight, pressing my palm into my knee to ease the pain. Outside, the first glimmers of dawn colored the sky in soft shades of gray and orange, but inside the room felt suffocatingly still. My shepherd mix Hank was lying under the table, his eyes half closed in sleep, his nails twitching slightly as if chasing something in a dream. Upstairs, my younger sister Mia, all of 17 years old, was still unconscious in the guest room. I could hear the faint hum of her music always playing, always blasting through those bright pink earbuds. The kind of girl who'd rather lose herself in comic books than face the chaos of the real world. She was still a kid, and I wasn't sure how she'd survive in a world that was quickly unraveling. The radio buzzed to life, the voice crackling in a high-pitched panic that cut through the stillness of the apartment. The announcer's voice trembled. Repeat, all regional hospitals are closing their doors until further notice. EMS units are instructed not to transport patients. If you experience flu-like symptoms or signs of aggression in loved ones, do not approach. Authorities are on their way. Stay in hiding. Stay away from those infected. Then nothing. Just static. The news felt like a punch in the gut. I sat there listening to the empty room, waiting for something to make sense. But nothing did. Everything was wrong, and I couldn't make sense of it. The usual noise of the city, the distant sound of traffic sirens, honking horns, was replaced by an eerie emptiness that seemed to swallow the world outside. I looked over at Hank, his sleepy eyes barely open, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The alarm bells were ringing in my head, and I couldn't ignore them any longer. The world was changing, and fast. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was Sarah. She'd been on a night shift at the trauma center. I hit the speakerphone button, my fingers trembling. Hank perked up at the sound of Sarah's voice. "Caitlin," Sarah's voice cracked, filled with adrenaline. "They just locked down the triage doors. The patients, they're biting staff. Actual biting, like people are becoming..." She cut off a shriek, followed by the sound of metal scraping, then a wet thud. The line went silent. My heart pounded in my chest. I jumped up, slamming my hand down on the kitchen table. The phone screen had gone dark. It had dropped out of service. No signal. I grabbed my Mossberg from behind the pantry door, the cold steel familiar in my hands, but it felt heavier than I remembered. Ex-Marine Dad's legacy. I didn't know when I'd last touched it, but it felt right in my hands now. I shoved 2 boxes of shells into my pockets almost mechanically. If things were as bad as Sarah said, I wasn't going to take any chances. "Hank," I muttered, looking down at the dog as his ears shot up at the sound of my voice. "Get ready, boy." I limped upstairs, pain shooting through my knee as I moved, each step making me wince. But I didn't have time to care about the pain. Not now. I knocked on Mia's door as softly as I could, but she was already awake. I could hear the rustling of blankets as she sat up groggy, her eyes half-lidded. "Mia, wake up," I said, voice low but firm. "We need to move. Now." She blinked a couple of times, rubbing the mascara-streaked smudges from her eyes, and then she stared at me, puzzled. "What's going on? Is this another prank?" I didn't answer. I just looked at her. She saw it in my face, the panic, the fear. She tossed her phone into her hoodie pocket and shot me a nod. "All right, what do we need to do?" I didn't hesitate. We moved like drill sergeants, no words needed. The sound of the lock on the window snapping open echoed in the still apartment. The deadbolt on the front door clicked into place with a sense of finality. I shoved the couch against the door for extra security. The movements were frantic, urgent. Mia grabbed a flashlight, and I told her to grab batteries. Hank was already at the door, alert, sniffing the air. I was ready for whatever came next, but the question was, what the hell was next? I felt a lump form in my throat, but I pushed it down. "Stay quiet, stay put." We let the guard roll in. I told Mia, my voice steady, but inside the storm was brewing. My pulse pounded in my ears as I checked the Mossberg again, loading the shells. Outside, the sky was starting to change, clouds tinged with orange above the skyline. Something burned in the distance, visible through the narrow gap in the blinds. A reflection of the world on fire. I didn't want to think about what it meant. A sedan screamed past the window, fishtailing the passenger door, swinging open like a broken jaw. I saw Mrs. Gomez from 3B, her hands slapping the steering wheel in frustration, her toddler still strapped in the back seat, both of them crying wordlessly. My chest tightened. I should help them, but I knew my knee wouldn't hold up if I tried to run. And I knew the risks. Close contact with panicked people was how EMTs ended up dead. It's how I lost so many good men in the field. I couldn't let that happen. Not to me, not to Mia. I shut the blinds, turned away from the window, and set my eyes on the shotgun. I wasn't a medic anymore. I wasn't saving lives anymore. Now I was just trying to survive. We kept moving quickly, methodically, securing the house as best we could. I grabbed the first aid kit from under the sink, checked the supplies. We had enough for a few days if we rationed. The bare minimum. Another shriek, a horrible metal sound not human. It echoed down the hall. A deeper alarm began wailing in the distance. The city's emergency siren. The one we only ever tested in July. Now it was real. A terrifying, shrieking howl that rattled the windows. Hank growled low, a deep rumble that vibrated in his chest. My heart jumped into my throat as I limped back down the stairs looking at Mia. "Stay close," I whispered. "Stay sharp." We moved to the kitchen and I turned on the TV. The screen flickered, the emergency bulletin scrawling across the bottom in bright red letters. "Stay indoors. Authorities en route. Remain inside. Do not approach anyone showing signs of aggression. Remain calm." There was no timestamp, no anchor, no reassurance. The city had gone dark. "Shit," I muttered under my breath. It was clear this wasn't a drill. It wasn't some overblown headline. People were dying out there. People were turning. And I didn't know how much time we had left. I limped upstairs to Mia's room. She was already packing her bag. Her eyes were wide now, but she wasn't crying. She was ready. Ready to fight just like I had been when I first signed up. "I'll get the rest," she said, looking at me with that same steady expression that had always been there. She didn't need to say it. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't a kid anymore. Neither of us were. The world had changed in an instant, and now it was up to us to survive. We moved quickly, ready for whatever came next. I felt my knee throb as I grabbed the shotgun, checked it again, and slung it over my shoulder. But no matter how much we prepared, I knew one thing for sure: nothing would be the same. The silence that had settled over the city was broken by the distant wail of sirens, a sound so foreign now that it felt almost like a warning. Not just the sirens, everything felt different, heavier, like the earth itself had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same. Alex and Mia moved swiftly through the apartment, gathering what little they could, water, food, a flashlight, and every step was punctuated by the unspoken tension that hung in the air. They knew somewhere deep inside that the world they once knew was slipping through their fingers. Outside, the streets of Louisville were eerily quiet. The usual rush of morning traffic was absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, and the gray morning sky, streaked with faint orange streaks of sunrise, cast an eerie glow over the deserted roads. Alex limped to the window, the weight of his gun heavy against his back. He peered through the blinds. The world outside was in chaos. Cars were abandoned in the middle of intersections, their doors wide open, their engines running. People were running no more, like stumbling through the streets. Faces filled with panic, eyes wide and mouths open in silent screams. There were no more honking horns, no more laughter, no more life. Only the distant sounds of calm echoing through the empty city. Mia stood behind him, her hand on the window frame, her eyes darting from the madness below to the relative safety of their apartment. "What happened, Alex? Why is everything so wrong?" Alex took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "I don't know, Mia, but we need to leave, now." He turned to her, his eyes cold with determination. "We're not staying here. We head toward the hospital. It's the only place I can think of where we might find answers. We'll stick together no matter what." Mia nodded, her fingers instinctively reaching for her phone. She paused, glancing at the screen in frustration as it flickered and went dark. "Shit!" Alex knew what she was thinking. They were cut off. No communication, no news. The world had gone dark, and it wasn't just the power outages or the loss of phone service. It was the fear of the kind that gripped your chest and twisted your stomach until you couldn't think clearly anymore. Alex grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and handed Mia a flashlight. "Keep it close. We're not taking any chances. We stay low, stay quiet, and if we get separated, I'll find you. We'll make it through." The words felt hollow as they left his mouth. How could he promise that? How could he promise anything in a world that was falling apart? But he said it anyway, for her, for himself. They had to have hope, no matter how fragile it felt. They moved quickly, making sure to lock the doors behind them as they left the apartment. Alex's heart raced as he limped down the stairs, trying to ignore the dull ache in his knee. Every step was agony, but there was no time to think about it. Not now. As they reached the ground floor, Alex pulled Mia to a stop. He motioned for her to stay silent. The apartment building was still eerily quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of an alarm somewhere in the city, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. Someone was coming. Alex held his breath, fingers tightening around the Mossberg. He motioned for Mia to stay low, and they pressed themselves against the wall, listening. The footsteps grew louder, and Alex's pulse quickened. Whoever was out there was getting closer. He could hear ragged breathing like someone struggling to move and a faint scrape of shoes dragging against the floor. He looked at Mia, her eyes wide with fear, but there was no time to talk. The footsteps stopped right outside their door. Alex's mind raced. Should he confront them? Wait for them to move. He had no idea who or what was on the other side. Then, to his relief, the footsteps shuffled away. But that wasn't the end of it. From the hallway, Alex could hear something, no, someone growing louder, a sickening moan echoing through the air. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl, something human, but distorted. Stay down, Alex whispered to Mia, his voice barely audible. He didn't know what was happening, but he had a sinking feeling in his gut that told him everything was about to get a lot worse. They stayed frozen, listening as the moans grew louder and closer. Alex felt his stomach twist with dread. He could barely make out the figure, stumbling down the hall, hunched over, dragging one leg behind it. The thing didn't seem to notice them. It was too lost in its own suffering, or perhaps it was just too far gone to care. The moaning was relentless, raw, and primal. Mia's breath hitched, and Alex turned to her, silently urging her to remain quiet. He gripped the shotgun tighter, knowing it was only a matter of time before they had to act. Finally, the figure stopped in front of their door. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, his mind screaming at him to do something, anything. But before he could react, the thing stumbled forward and collapsed against the door, thudding with a sickening crack. Alex's body went rigid. He could hear the low groan of the thing's body as it shifted and the scratching sounds of its nails against the wood. God, Mia whispered, her voice trembling. What is that? Alex didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was racing as he tried to process what was happening. He had seen things like this on TV zombie movies, survival shows. But this wasn't a movie. This wasn't fiction. It was real. The sound of the thing's rasping breath echoed through the hallway, a sickly reminder of the nightmare they were living through. Alex clenched his teeth and motioned for Mia to stay quiet. They stayed hidden, pressed against the wall, as the thing continued to claw at the door. Alex could feel the fear crawling up his spine. He had to get Mia out of here. But how? What the hell was going on? Was this just a flu or something else? Something worse? The scratching stopped. A tense silence followed, thick and suffocating. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the moaning began again. But this time the sound was distant, faint, as if the thing had finally moved on. Alex slowly exhaled, his body still taut with anxiety. He wasn't sure how long they had been frozen like that, but the moment they had was enough to feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. Let's go, Alex whispered, finally breaking the silence. We need to move. Mia nodded, her face pale but resolute. They had no time to waste. With one last glance toward the door, Alex led the way, limping out into the hallway and toward the front door. As they stepped into the street, the chaos of the world outside hit them full force. Smoke billowed from distant buildings, fires burned in the streets, and the city felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Stay close, Alex said, his voice firm. We make it to the hospital, and we survive. Mia didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They both knew what was coming. The world had changed, and now they were part of it. The journey had just begun. The city of Louisville, once full of life, now stood as a silent witness to the destruction unfolding. The streets were desolate, save for the occasional abandoned vehicle or scattered debris that told the story of a population in panic. Alex and Mia moved swiftly, sticking to alleyways and side streets, avoiding the open road where the chaos seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. The sense of urgency in the air was suffocating, the weight of every step growing heavier with each passing moment. Alex's knee throbbed with each limp, but he pushed through the pain. There was no time to stop. Not now, not when Sarah was still out there, trapped somewhere in the madness of the city's downfall. She'd been at the hospital when the first reports had come in. He couldn't lose her. Not after everything they had been through. Stay close, Alex said, his voice low but firm, as he glanced over his shoulder to check on Mia. She was just a few paces behind, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not for a second. Mia's expression was unreadable, but Alex could see the flicker of fear in her eyes whenever she thought he wasn't looking. She was trying to be brave, trying to play it cool, but they both knew the truth. The world as they knew it was gone, and they had no idea what lay ahead. The silence of the streets was broken only by the distant wail of sirens, though they no longer held any meaning. The emergency vehicles had long since ceased their routine runs, leaving the city's inhabitants to fend for themselves. The few remaining people Alex had seen out on the streets weren't looking for help. They were looking for survival in any form it could be found. Alex's thoughts were interrupted by a distant crash followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy dragging and unnervingly erratic. Mia froze beside him, her hand gripping his sleeve tightly. He held up his hand, signaling for her to stay quiet. His eyes scanned the alley ahead, the shadows playing tricks on his mind. The footsteps were closer now, each step dragging and scraping against the pavement. Alex's stomach turned. They weren't alone. They pressed their backs against the wall, staying as still as possible. Alex's heart beat louder than the footsteps approaching, thumping in his chest as his mind raced. If they were spotted now, there was no chance they'd make it to the hospital. The thing that was coming, whatever it was, wouldn't stop at just one. They'd be surrounded in seconds. Mia's breath was quick, shallow, as if she could feel the same panic building inside her. Alex clenched his jaw, his grip on the shotgun tightening. He had to stay calm. For her. For both of them. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away, and for a long moment there was nothing but the sound of ragged breathing and the occasional rustle of clothing. Alex could see the figure now, its shape barely visible in the dim light. It was hunched over, dragging one leg behind it like it had lost the ability to walk normally. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its movements, jerky, erratic, told him all he needed to know. The creature, if that's what it even was, wasn't human anymore. A low, guttural moan escaped its lips, and Alex's stomach clenched. He could smell it now, a mixture of decay and something metallic like blood that had been left to fester too long. The creature's head tilted as if sensing their presence. Alex held his breath, willing it to move on, but it didn't. It stumbled forward toward them. Alex moved instinct, driving him. He grabbed Mia's arm and pulled her back, but the creature was too close now. Too close for comfort. "Stay behind me," Alex hissed as he raised the shotgun. He fired before he even realized what he was doing, the blast reverberating through the narrow alley. The force of the shot slammed into his shoulders, sending a jolt of pain through his body. But he didn't care. The creature, whatever it was, collapsed with a sickening thud, its body jerking and twitching on the ground. Mia gasped, her hand covering her mouth in shock. Alex didn't wait to see if the thing was dead. He grabbed her arm again, his fingers tight with urgency. "Let's go." They didn't stop, not even to glance at the crumpled body behind them. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to get to the hospital to find Sarah. But with each step, the streets seemed to close in on them, more dangerous with every corner they turned. "Alex!" Mia's voice cracked, her eyes wide with panic. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Alex said through gritted teeth, "but I do know that we can't stop. Not now." They rounded another corner, only to be met with another sight that made Alex's blood run cold. A group of people, their faces twisted in terror, were huddled together near a storefront, their hands pressed against the glass, their eyes wide with fear. But it wasn't just fear that Alex saw. It was desperation. These were people who were no longer trying to survive. They were simply waiting for the inevitable. "We can't go that way," Mia said, her voice a whisper of dread. Alex nodded, his mind racing. There was no way around it. The hospital was their only hope. He didn't know what had happened to the world, but he knew that Sarah was there. She had to be. They pushed on, avoiding the main streets as much as possible. They stuck to the alleys, moving quickly and quietly, but even the relative peace of the back streets couldn't ease the tension in Alex's chest. The city was a ghost town now, abandoned, destroyed, and filled with threats lurking around every corner. Finally, they reached the outskirts of the hospital. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he looked up at the towering building, its windows dark, its doors closed. No lights, no signs of life, just the faint hum of generators, the only indication that anyone was still inside. "Are you sure this is the hospital?" Mia whispered, her voice shaky. Alex didn't answer. He didn't have to. The security gate that blocked their path told him everything he needed to know. It was locked down just like everything else in the city, just like the entire world. He could feel the weight of the moment settle in. They were trapped. But trapped or not, they had no choice but to move forward. They had to "We're getting in," Alex said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We have to." He looked down at Mia, his eyes filled with determination. "Stay with me. Stay quiet. And we'll find Sarah." The sound of distant screams pierced the air, but Alex didn't flinch. They were going to survive. They had to. And in that moment, as they stood before the locked gate of the hospital, he realized something. The city wasn't just broken, the world was. But as long as they kept moving, kept fighting, they might just stand a chance. They could survive. But first they had to get inside. The gates of the hospital loomed ahead, a silent reminder of everything that had changed. Alex stood in front of them, eyes locked on the metal bars, his pulse racing. The faint hum of the emergency generator buzzed in the background, but there were no lights, no movement. It was as though the hospital had been abandoned. The city outside was in ruins, but inside the walls of this once thriving medical center, things were eerily still. "How do we get in?" Mia asked, her voice barely a whisper as she stood beside him. Her fingers clutched the flashlight tightly, and her other hand rested against the strap of the backpack that weighed heavily on her shoulders. Alex didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the hospital, looking for a way through. His mind was sharp, calculating the odds. They had no choice but to get inside. Sarah was in there somewhere, and he couldn't leave without her. He had to find her. He owed her that much. The front entrance was shut tight, but Alex noticed a side door partially hidden in the shadows with a security camera dangling loosely, its lens cracked. He motioned for Mia to follow him, and they moved swiftly toward it, avoiding any noise. Every step felt like it could be their last. "We're not the only ones out here," Alex muttered under his breath. His eyes flicked to the alleyways behind them, scanning for any movement. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching them. Mia didn't reply. She just nodded, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. They had been through so much already, and yet there was a part of her that still wasn't ready for what lay ahead. But neither of them had a choice. They had to keep moving. The side door was locked, but Alex wasn't about to be stopped by something as simple as a lock. He pulled out his crowbar, wedging it into the gap between the door and the frame. With a grunt, he forced the door open, the sound of metal scraping against metal, piercing the air. Mia flinched at the noise, but Alex was already through, holding the door open for her to follow. They stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and something else. Something stale, as though the building had been untouched for far too long. The hallway in front of them was dark, the only light coming from the emergency exit signs glowing faintly above them. There was no sound, no sign of life. It felt like a graveyard. "Stay close," Alex whispered, his voice low. He kept his hand on his shotgun, ready for anything. Every shadow seemed like a threat. Every creak of the building's old bones sounded like it was preparing to collapse on top of them. But they couldn't stop. Not yet. They moved down the hallway, stepping carefully, their footsteps muffled against the linoleum floor. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional distant thud or clatter echoing through the hospital. The building was still standing, but it felt like it was on the verge of falling apart. Alex's mind raced. What had happened here? How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? The last he'd heard, the hospital was full of patients, sick, injured, and fighting for their lives. Now it was a ghost town. They turned a corner and Alex froze. Ahead of them, the hallway was lined with empty gurneys, their wheels squeaking slightly as they shifted in place. A few doors were ajar, and Alex could hear muffled voices coming from one of them. But the voices weren't human. Mia noticed it too, her body tensing as she took a step back, instinctively reaching for her own weapon. But Alex held up a hand, signaling for her to stay quiet. The sound grew louder, wet, guttural, and unmistakably not human. Alex's stomach twisted as he realized what they were hearing, the unmistakable sound of infected people roaming the hospital in search of prey. And now they were getting closer. "We need to get out of here," Mia whispered, her voice shaking. "Now." But Alex didn't move. He couldn't. Not when he was so close. He had to find Sarah. "Stay calm," he said, his voice barely audible. "We'll find another way, but we can't leave yet." They moved quietly through the hall, staying to the shadows as much as possible. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't afford to panic. Not now. Every step felt like it could be their last, but he pushed on. They had no choice. The hallway stretched on, and the further they went, the more they encountered signs of the chaos that had erupted here. Bloodstains smeared across the walls, gurneys abandoned in hallways, and doors left wide open, revealing rooms that had been torn apart. It was as though the hospital had become a war zone, a place where humanity had lost its fight for survival. Finally, they reached a set of double doors, the kind that led into the hospital's main emergency ward. The doors were locked, but Alex didn't hesitate. He pulled out his crowbar again, wedging it into the lock and forcing the door open. The sound of the doors crashing open echoed down the hall, and Alex felt a rush of adrenaline surge through his veins. They had to get inside. They had to find Sarah. They stepped into the emergency room, and the sight that met them was nothing short of horrifying. The room was in complete disarray. Overturned beds, medical supplies scattered across the floor, and the stench of decay hanging in the air. But worse than the chaos was the sight of the bodies, dozens of them. Most of them lying still, but some of them twitching, their eyes wide open, their mouths hanging open in a silent scream. Alex's heart sank as he realized what had happened. The hospital hadn't just been overrun, it had become a hunting ground. A place where the infected roamed freely, taking down anyone in their path. This is insane, Mia muttered under her breath. She had never seen anything like this. Neither had Alex, but he wasn't about to let fear stop him now. We have to keep moving, he said, his voice steady. We're getting closer. Sarah has to be here. They moved through the emergency room, cautiously keeping their eyes peeled for any sign of life, or worse, any sign of the infected. The building felt empty, hollow, as if it had been abandoned for months, not days. The flickering fluorescent lights above them cast long shadows on the walls, making it impossible to tell where the danger might be lurking. Alex's thoughts raced. How long had Sarah been trapped here? Had she been bitten? Was she still alive? He couldn't allow himself to think the worst. Not yet. Not when they were so close. They moved through the hallways, following the signs to the trauma unit. Alex could feel the weight of the shotgun against his side, the only thing that stood between him and whatever was waiting ahead. Every turn they made felt like they were getting closer to the heart of the chaos. And then as they rounded another corner, Alex saw it. A figure, Sarah, standing in the middle of the hallway, her face pale, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was shaking, but she was alive. Sarah, Alex shouted, his voice cracking with relief. Sarah! She turned toward him, her eyes wide with shock, but then her face softened. She stumbled toward him, her steps unsteady, but she was alive. I thought you were, she started, but her voice broke off as Alex pulled her into a tight embrace. I'm here. We're here, he whispered. We're getting out of here. But even as they held each other, Alex knew the battle wasn't over. The hospital was still crawling with danger. The infection was everywhere. But for now, in this one moment, they had found each other. And that was enough. The moment Alex wrapped his arms around Sarah, relief washed over him like a wave. She was alive. After everything, after all the chaos, Sarah was still here. He could feel the heat of her body, the tremble in her muscles, as she held on to him, and for a second, just a second, the world seemed almost normal again. But the brief moment of solace didn't last. The hospital wasn't safe. It had never been safe, not since the infection first took hold of the city. It had become a hunting ground, and now the infected weren't the only danger. The building was filled with broken remnants of what once was people struggling to survive, hiding in the dark corners of the ward, trying to avoid the relentless wave of infection. Sarah, Alex breathed, his voice low but filled with urgency. We need to go, now. She nodded, her face pale but her eyes filled with determination. I thought, Sarah started, but her voice faltered, and Alex could see the uncertainty in her gaze. I thought I was alone. I thought, you're not alone, Alex cut her off, his hand gripping hers tighter. We're leaving together. I'm not letting you out of my sight. He didn't wait for another word. There was no time for explanations, no time for catching up on what had happened in the hours or maybe days they had been separated. They had to move, and they had to move fast. Mia was already several steps ahead, her back pressed against the wall, peering around the corner cautiously. We've got company, she whispered, eyes wide with a mix of fear and resolve. Alex turned toward the hallway, his senses sharpened. The faint sound of dragging footsteps and guttural moans echoed from down the corridor. The infected were close, too close for comfort. We're not going out that way, Alex said, his mind already racing through options. The emergency exit was blocked by a pile of debris from earlier when the building had been torn apart by chaos. The only other option was the loading dock, but that meant crossing the entire hospital floor, and if the infected were waiting there, Mia spoke up, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. There's another way. There's a stairwell that leads out to the back. It's hidden and no one's been using it since the lockdown. Alex turned to Sarah, seeing the exhaustion in her. Can you walk? He asked softly. Sarah nodded, though it was clear she was barely holding herself together. Her hands shook, her clothes torn and bloodied, but she was alive, and that was enough for now. We'll make it, Alex said firmly. Let's move. They started down the hallway, moving quietly, trying not to make a sound. Alex kept the shotgun at the ready, his eyes scanning every shadow, every doorway. The hospital felt like a maze, a never-ending labyrinth of sterile white walls that now seemed to close in on them. The moaning grew louder, and Alex's heart rate spiked. They were getting closer. The infected were close. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. They had to get out. Stay close, he said, and Sarah and Mia followed him as they turned down another corridor. As they approached the stairwell, Alex's senses heightened. The metallic smell of blood was thick in the air, and he could hear the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps that didn't belong to them. Damn it, Alex muttered under his breath. Alex, Mia hissed, her voice barely audible. They're right behind us. They had no time to run, no time to hide. The door to the stairwell was just ahead, and Alex slammed his shoulder into it, pushing it open with all his strength. The door creaked loudly, but it was enough to get them inside. He held the door open just long enough for Mia and Sarah to slip through, then followed them inside, slamming the door shut behind them. Go, Alex shouted. They ran up the stairs as fast as they could, but the sound of the infected's footsteps grew louder with every passing second. Alex glanced over his shoulder. The moans were getting closer. They were being hunted. As they reached the second floor, the lights flickered, then died, plunging them into complete darkness. Alex cursed under his breath, but there was no time to stop and check the situation. He reached for the flashlight in his pocket and flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the path ahead. We're almost there, Alex said, trying to reassure Sarah and Mia, though he could feel the weight of his own fear growing. They were running out of time, but as they rounded the corner, Alex's heart skipped a beat. The stairwell door at the top of the next flight was ajar, and through the small crack, Alex could see the faint glow of light. The exit was within reach, but so were the infected. A low growl echoed from the shadows, followed by a series of wet, gurgling breaths. Alex's pulse quickened as he turned to Mia. We have to move now. But before they could make another move, the door at the top of the stairwell swung open and a figure stepped into view. It was a man, his face twisted in pain, his eyes hollow and bloodshot. He staggered toward them, his hands reaching out like claws, his mouth hanging open in a grotesque rictus. The man didn't speak. He didn't need to. His very presence was a threat. Alex's finger tightened on the trigger, but Mia was faster. She swung the crowbar she'd been carrying, striking the man across the face with a sickening crunch. The man staggered back, his head snapping sideways, but he didn't go down. His fingers twitched, and his mouth opened wider, emitting a low, snarling growl. Get back, Alex shouted, shoving Mia behind him as he raised the shotgun. He fired the blast, deafening in the narrow stairwell. The man's body jerked back, his chest collapsing in on itself, but he didn't stop moving. The creature, it wasn't a man anymore, that shambled forward, its fingers twitching, its mouth still open, trying to bite to infect. Headshots, Alex gritted, pulling the trigger again. The second shot landed squarely in the man's temple, and this time he crumpled to the ground, motionless. But Alex didn't wait to see if the body stayed down. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the stairwell door. Mia followed closely behind her, crowbar still gripped tightly in her hands. They couldn't stay here. Come on, Alex urged, his voice rough with panic. This way. They burst through the door and into the bright daylight, the fresh air hitting them like a slap to the face. They had made it, but the hospital was still standing, and the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Alex looked around. They were at the back of the hospital near a loading dock, empty just like the rest of the city. The only sound was the distant hum of generators and the occasional gust of wind. But they weren't alone. From the shadows, more figures emerged. Two men, their faces bloodied, their eyes wide with panic. They weren't infected, but the desperation in their eyes said everything Alex needed to know. These were people who would do anything to survive. Alex's hand tightened around his shotgun, but he didn't raise it. Not yet. They had no choice but to face the threat head on. The men stopped just a few feet away, breathing heavily. One of them held a knife in his hand, his eyes darting between Alex, Mia, and Sarah. We need help, the man with the knife said, his voice shaking. We can't make it out there alone. Alex didn't answer. He just stared at the men, assessing their every move. The moment he let his guard down was the moment they were all dead. The world had changed, and now trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. Go, Alex said, his voice cold, his eyes never leaving the men. Get out of here before things get worse. The men hesitated for a moment before backing away, their faces etched with fear. They didn't need any further encouragement. They turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows of the parking lot. Alex watched them go, his finger still on the trigger. But he didn't lower the gun. Not yet. Not until they were far enough away. Let's go, he said, turning to Sarah and Mia. We've got a long way to go. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and red. The horizon, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a tombstone. They were alive. But for how long? The city of Louisville was nothing like the place Alex remembered. The streets were choked with smoke, the skyline barely visible through a haze of ash and burning debris. What had once been a bustling city full of life and noise was now a hollow shell of its former self. The occasional gust of wind carried with it the scent of decay and death signs of a world that had fallen apart far faster than anyone could have imagined. As Alex led Mia and Sarah through the alleyways, his heart pounded with urgency. They couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to rest. Every corner was a potential threat, every shadow a potential predator waiting to strike. The streets were no longer safe. The infected were everywhere. The city had become their hunting ground. "Do you think anyone else made it out?" Mia asked quietly, her voice filled with uncertainty. Alex didn't answer right away. He had thought about that question ever since they'd left the hospital. Were they the last survivors? Were there others still out there waiting to be found? It was hard to say. The chaos was so overwhelming that it was impossible to know who was still alive. But one thing was certain: if they didn't keep moving, they wouldn't last long enough to find out. "I don't know," Alex replied, finally, his voice steady. "But we're still here, and that's all that matters right now." Sarah, walking beside him, gave him a tired but understanding look. She had been through hell. She was still in shock, her body trembling from both exhaustion and fear. But she hadn't said a word about it. Alex admired her strength. He wasn't sure how she managed to keep it together after everything she had seen, but he was grateful for it. They needed each other now more than ever. "I keep thinking about the people we left behind," Sarah said softly, her voice distant, as if she were speaking to herself. "The patients, the staff, everyone who didn't make it. I, I feel like we abandoned them." Alex's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He could hear the guilt in Sarah's voice, and he understood it. They had all felt it. The moment the hospital had locked its doors, everything had changed. No one had been prepared for what happened next. Not the doctors, not the nurses, not the government, and certainly not the people who had once thought they were safe. "We didn't abandon them," Alex said firmly, trying to make her understand. "We did what we could, but now we have to take care of each other. We're the ones who made it out, and that means we need to fight to stay alive. For them." Sarah nodded, her gaze hardening. Alex could see that she was struggling to accept the harsh reality of the situation. The kind of reality where survival meant sacrificing the things you cared about. But she would come around. They all would. The alley ahead opened up into a wide street, and Alex paused, scanning the area. He could see the distant glow of fires burning in the distance, the flickering orange flames lighting up the night sky. It was hard to tell where the fires were coming from, but he didn't want to find out. The last thing they needed was to stumble into a mob of panicked survivors or infected. "Stay low," Alex muttered, motioning for Mia and Sarah to follow him as they crouched down behind a pile of rubble. They had to be careful. Every step they took brought them closer to the heart of the chaos, and that was the last place they wanted to be. They moved quickly but quietly, keeping to the shadows. The street was eerily silent, except for the occasional distant howl of sirens or the ominous crackle of burning buildings. Alex kept his eyes on the ground ahead, his mind focused on getting them out of the city. The longer they stayed here, the more likely it was that they would run into trouble. After what felt like hours, they reached a narrow street that led toward the outskirts of the city. The air was cooler here, the smoke less dense, but the silence was almost unbearable. Alex could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. They hadn't seen another soul since leaving the hospital, and the isolation was starting to get to him. The silence had a way of making you feel small, insignificant, as if the world was forgetting about you. "This way," Alex whispered, motioning toward an old, overgrown path that led toward a more rural area on the edge of town. He hoped it would be safer there, away from the fires and the chaos of the city center. They turned onto the path, moving quickly but cautiously. The further they got from the city, the quieter it became, until all they could hear was the sound of their own footsteps crunching against the gravel beneath them. As they neared the end of the path, Alex saw something that made his heart skip a beat. A large, dark shape moved in the distance, just beyond the tree line. It was too far to make out clearly, but it was big, and it was moving toward them. "Stay down," Alex hissed, pulling Sarah and Mia behind a large tree, his shotgun at the ready. He motioned for them to remain silent as he watched the figure grow closer. It was still too far away to make a clear judgment, but the last thing he wanted was to find out what it was up close. The figure stopped, and Alex held his breath. For a moment, there was complete silence. He could hear his own heart pounding in his chest, and he could feel the tension in the air. The figure remained still for several long seconds, and Alex wondered if it had spotted them. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure turned and began to retreat back into the trees. Alex exhaled in relief. It hadn't seen them, but it was still out there, still watching. "Let's move," Alex whispered, motioning for them to follow him. They didn't stop to look back. There was no time to waste. They continued down the path, moving as fast as they could without making any noise. Alex's mind was racing, his thoughts jumping from one worst-case scenario to the next. They had to get out of this city. They had to find somewhere safe. But even as he pushed those thoughts aside, he knew that safety was becoming a distant dream. The world had changed, and it wasn't going to get any easier. Just as they were about to exit the path and step onto the main road, a loud crash echoed through the trees. The figure from earlier had returned. This time it wasn't alone. Several more shapes, moving in unison, appeared on the edge of the woods. The sound of low guttural growls filled the air. "Run!" Alex yelled, his voice sharp with panic. He grabbed Mia and Sarah by the arms, pulling them toward the road as fast as he could. Behind them, the sound of the creature's footsteps grew louder, and Alex could hear the crackling of twigs and branches as they gave chase. They burst into the open road, but there was nowhere to hide. The creatures were gaining on them, their twisted forms moving faster than Alex had anticipated. He could see them now, pale, emaciated bodies, their eyes wild and unseeing mouths hanging open in desperate hunger. Faster, Alex shouted, but his voice felt hollow, swallowed by the sounds of the chase. They were so close now, too close. Mia stumbled her ankle, catching on a rock, and she fell to the ground. Alex turned to grab her, but Sarah was already there, pulling her up by the arm. "Go!" Alex shouted. "I've got this!" He turned to face the creatures, his shotgun raised, ready to fire. But there were too many. The odds weren't in their favor. "Get ready!" Alex shouted as he prepared for the inevitable. The night had descended over the abandoned streets of Louisville like a heavy blanket, the only light coming from distant fires and the occasional flicker of streetlights that had managed to stay intact. The city was quiet now, far too quiet for comfort. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he led Sarah and Mia down the dimly lit road. His instincts screamed at him to stay alert. Every rustling leaf, every distant cry from beyond the horizon felt like a warning. They weren't alone. "We should have stayed in the woods," Mia muttered, her voice edged with fatigue and frustration. She kept her head down, avoiding looking at the burned-out buildings and abandoned vehicles that lined the street. "I don't like it here, Alex." "I know, Mia." Alex said, his voice grim, but he didn't stop walking. They had to keep moving, but we need to keep pushing forward. There's a farm up ahead, just past the ridge. We can rest there for the night. Sarah, who had been quiet for most of the journey, finally spoke, her voice hoarse from dehydration and exhaustion. "How much farther?" Alex glanced at the horizon. The distant flicker of firelight seemed to beckon them, but it was hard to say if it was coming from another survivor or from the wreckage of the city. They had passed the edge of town hours ago, but the sense of impending danger still hung heavy in the air. "Not much farther," he lied. The truth was, they had no idea what lay ahead. All they had was a hope that the farm he remembered from childhood still existed, that it was still untouched by the chaos of the world outside. They passed by a row of abandoned shops, their windows shattered, their doors hanging open like the ruins of a forgotten world. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the cracked pavement. There was no sign of life here, no signs of movement, no sounds of survivors trying to make a stand. It was as though the city had already given up, and in some ways it had. It was hard to imagine how the world had gone from bustling cities and vibrant communities to this wasteland. As they continued, the unease that had been building in Alex's chest only grew stronger. Something was wrong. They were being watched, but by what he couldn't tell. His eyes flicked to the darkened corners of the streets, to the alleys, where he knew danger could be lurking. He hadn't seen any infected for a while, but the fear that they were out there somewhere never left him. The world had changed. People had changed. Survival was no longer just about getting through the day. It was about keeping what little humanity they had left intact. Suddenly a sound broke through the silence, a low, guttural growl, barely audible but unmistakable. Alex froze his hand, instinctively going for the shotgun slung over his shoulder. Mia's head snapped around, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah stiffened beside him, her breath catching in her throat. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Alex nodded. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift in the air, the tension in the atmosphere. Something was out there, something dangerous. His mind raced as he scanned the darkness. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. They weren't alone anymore. "Stay close," Alex said, his voice low but steady. He stepped in front of Sarah and Mia, his body tense with anticipation. Every instinct told him to run to find shelter and wait until whatever it was had passed, but that wasn't an option anymore. They had no time to waste. They had to keep moving, had to push through whatever was coming for them. The growl grew louder, more frantic. Alex's eyes narrowed as he saw the shape moving in the shadows ahead. It was too large to be just one person, too erratic in its movements, too unnatural. Alex Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is it?" Alex didn't answer. He didn't need to. He saw it now, four figures stumbling toward them, their bodies hunched and broken, their faces contorted in grotesque expressions of hunger. They were infected, and they were closing in. "Run!" Alex shouted. Without waiting for a response, he shoved Mia and Sarah ahead of him, pushing them down the street as fast as they could go. The infected weren't just walking, they were running faster than Alex had expected. They were faster than they had been the last time they encountered the creatures. His heart raced as he turned to face the oncoming threat, his shotgun raised and ready. The first infected lunged at him, its twisted body moving in a blur of sickening speed. Alex fired without thinking, the blast of the shotgun deafening in the quiet night air. The infected creature's head exploded in a spray of blood and bone, but the others were already on them. The second one grabbed Sarah, its hands clawing at her shoulders. She screamed, but Alex was there, pulling it off her with all his strength and firing another shot at point-blank range. Mia screamed behind him, her voice filled with terror. Alex spun around just in time to see another infected come at her, its mouth wide open, snapping like a wild animal. He didn't hesitate. He fired again, the blast taking the creature down, but more were coming. "There's too many," Maya cried, her voice panicked. "We keep moving," Alex shouted back. "Get to the damn farm." He pushed them forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as they ran. The shotgun was heavy in his hands and his knee was on fire with each step, but there was no time to slow down. They had to keep running. The creatures were right behind them, their growls getting louder, more desperate. They could hear the drag of their feet on the ground, the scrape of their hands against the pavement. Just as they reached the end of the street, Alex spotted something in the distance, the faint outline of a building. The farm. It was still standing. A brief flicker of hope surged through him. "We're almost there," Alex shouted. "Keep going." They made it to the gate, Alex slamming it open with the force of his shoulder. The farm was dark, but it was still there, still intact. He shoved Mia and Sarah inside, closing the gate behind them with a sense of finality. They were safe for now. Alex leaned against the gate, panting, his heart racing. The infected had stopped just outside the farm, their growls fading into the night. For a moment, they just stood there, trying to catch their breath. "We can't stay here long," Alex said, his voice strained. "We need to get inside, lock everything down." Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. "We need to barricade ourselves in. They'll come back. They always do." Alex turned to Mia, who was still trembling but trying to keep it together. "We'll be okay," he said. "We're safe for now. But we need to stay quiet. We can't let them know we're here." Mia swallowed hard, nodding, though she looked anything but convinced. Alex knew that the moment they thought they were safe, the danger would find them again. The world had changed, and the infected weren't their only threat anymore. People were desperate, and that was just as dangerous. They moved inside the farmhouse, locking the door behind them. It was dark, but the faint glow of the moonlight seeping through the windows was enough to see. The house smelled of stale air and dust, and it felt cold and lifeless. It had once been a home, a sanctuary, but now it was just another place to survive. Alex took a deep breath and looked around. The place was empty except for the old furniture and the remnants of a life that had been abandoned. He set the shotgun down, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "We're here," he said quietly. "But this isn't over. It's just beginning." They had made it through another day, but Alex knew deep down that they couldn't outrun the storm forever. Something was coming, something bigger than just the infected, something that would test them in ways they couldn't yet understand. And they would have to face it together. The night had swallowed the farm whole, the blackness so thick that it seemed to press in on them from all sides. The air was cold, biting at Alex's skin, and the faint sounds of the wind howling through the trees outside were the only reminders of the world beyond the farmhouse. Inside, the house was dim, save for the faint glow of a lantern Alex had found tucked away in a corner. Mia sat on the old wooden chair by the fireplace, her arms wrapped around herself, staring into the fire. Her face was pale, her eyes dull with exhaustion and fear, but there was a quiet determination in her expression. She wasn't a kid anymore. She had grown up in the last few days, just like he had. Sarah, too, was quieter than usual. She sat on the couch, her eyes flicking toward the door, every few seconds as if expecting the infected to come crashing through at any moment. Alex didn't blame her. They had been through too much to feel safe. Not yet. Alex paced back and forth across the room, his mind racing. The farm felt like a prison, now its walls no longer offering comfort, but a cage. They were safe for the moment, but how long would that last? The infected would come back. They always did. The question was, how long could they keep running? He stopped by the window looking out at the barren fields that stretched out before them. He couldn't see anything in the dark, but he could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. The silence outside was deafening. The city was a world away now, and yet it felt like it was still just a stone's throw away. They had to keep moving. They couldn't stay here forever. But where could they go? Where could they find safety when it felt like the whole world had turned against them? The sound of a distant car horn broke through his thoughts. It was faint, almost too far to hear. But it was there. His heart skipped a beat. Someone else was out there. Maybe a survivor. Maybe help. Alex grabbed the shotgun, his instincts kicking in. "Stay here," he said to Mia and Sarah. His voice was rough, but there was no time for hesitation. "I'll check it out." Before either of them could protest, he was out the door, stepping into the cold night air. The wind whipped around him, the dust and leaves swirling in the darkness. He didn't have a clear plan, didn't know what he was walking into, but he had to see. He couldn't just sit here and wait. He had to know. The sound of the car horn came again, closer this time. Alex pushed through the tall grass, moving toward the road. His heart pounded in his chest as he neared the gate that separated the farm from the rest of the world. The flashlight in his hand flickered as he scanned the road ahead. It was hard to see much in the dark, but the faint outline of a vehicle appeared through the haze. It was a truck, old, worn, but still running. The headlights flickered, cutting through the darkness, and Alex's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was their chance. The truck slowed as it approached the engine, sputtering slightly before it came to a stop in front of the gate. Alex raised the shotgun, his finger hovering over the trigger. He didn't know who this was, didn't know if they were friend or foe, but he couldn't take chances. The driver's side window rolled down slowly, revealing a man in his 40s, his face weathered and worn, but his eyes were sharp. He looked like he had been through hell, but there was something familiar about the way he carried himself. "Hey there," the man called out, his voice hoarse but calm. "You the ones holed up in the farm?" Alex hesitated for a moment, studying the man's face. He didn't recognize him, but that didn't mean much anymore. The world had become a dangerous place. You couldn't trust anyone, not without proof. "We are," Alex said cautiously, keeping the shotgun pointed low but ready. The man raised his hand slightly, as if to show he wasn't a threat. "Good. I've been looking for survivors. The city's crawling with them, those things. I barely made it out myself." Alex's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "Name's Mark. I used to live in Louisville. Before all this, I'm just trying to find other people who are still alive." Alex lowered the shotgun slightly, but didn't let his guard down. "Why should we trust you?" Mark glanced around, his eyes darting to the distant woods. "You can't trust anyone these days. But I'm not here to hurt you. I've got food, water, and some supplies. Enough for a few days, maybe longer if we work together." Alex didn't answer right away. He glanced back toward the farmhouse where Mia and Sarah were still waiting. No doubt worried, the temptation to open the gate and invite Mark in was strong. He was offering help, something they desperately needed. But trust didn't come easy anymore. And no matter how much he wanted to believe Mark, Alex knew he had to be careful. Mark must have sensed the hesitation. "I know it's hard to trust anyone these days, but we've all got to work together if we're going to make it out of this alive. You don't want to be alone in a world like this." Alex thought about it for a moment, weighing his options. He had no way of knowing for sure if Mark was telling the truth, but the man had survived this long, and that meant something. They couldn't survive on their own forever. They needed supplies, and Mark had them. If nothing else, he could be their ticket to getting out of this hellhole. "All right," Alex said, his voice steady. "We'll take what you've got, but we're not letting you in until we're sure you're not a threat." Mark nodded. "Fair enough." Alex opened the gate slowly, the creaking of the old metal loud in the stillness. Mark's truck rolled in the headlights, casting long shadows as it came to a stop in front of the farmhouse. Alex kept his eyes on him the whole time, but when Mark stepped out of the truck, he seemed genuine enough. "You've got supplies?" Alex asked, his voice low. Mark opened the truck bed, revealing several large bags of food, cans of water, and even a few medical kits. "Like I said, I've been scavenging. There's more where this came from." Alex motioned for Sarah and Mia to come out. "It's safe for now." Sarah stepped out first, followed by Mia, both of them eyeing Mark with a mix of curiosity and caution. "What's the deal?" Sarah asked, her voice still rough from the strain of the past few days. Mark gave a weary smile. "The deal is that we're all still alive, and as long as we keep working together, maybe we'll stay that way." For a moment, Alex stood there, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. They had made it through the worst of it so far, but the road ahead was still uncertain. He didn't know if Mark could be trusted, but right now he had no choice but to take the risk. All right, Alex said, his voice steady. We take what we can and we move out at dawn. We head north. Find somewhere better. Mark nodded. That's the plan. As the night stretched on, the group settled in, organizing the supplies Mark had brought and securing the farmhouse as best they could. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope on the horizon. But Alex knew it was fleeting. The world had changed and survival was never guaranteed. Not for anyone. But for now they had each other, and that was enough.